Good evening, good afternoon, good day, good night, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining the Black Belt Academy of Surgical Skills. My name is David O'Regan. I'm a cardiac surgeon in Yorkshire in the United Kingdom. I am the director of the Faculty of Surgical Trainers for Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, and I'm a visiting professor at Imperial College. Thank you very much indeed to the 2,759 followers from across the globe, including Venezuela, Mongolia, Cambodia, and many more. And thank you too for the 2,076 likes. I'd really like to reach 2,800 if possible and ask you to spread the word. I'm delighted to be joining the Merseyside Surgical Society on the 19th of June to launch the local Black Belt Academy of Surgical Skills with Sensei John Taylor, who happens to be a 5th Dan in karate as well. I'm really looking forward to that event. Tonight we're going to be talking about knots. And as I was doing a bit of research and looking at this, I was interested to find out that knots and ropes have been around since 13,000 BC, and fossilized remains have been found in Stone Age dwellings. And it is thought that they were used to fix stones and materials to sticks and logs to help make tools. In 8,000 to 6,500 BC, textiles were being developed in the cradle of civilization. And in 4000 BC, the Egyptians actually made a spindle to make ropes and string and fabrics as well. In 1300 AD, hemp, the plant material, started to become made into rope. And about that time, the Arabs were using knots as part of their weaving to adorn their fabrics. What is interesting, in 1400 AD, an ancient Inca tribe in Peru were using knots as a form of communication and a record of events, and they were called quipo, or talking knots. In 1600, macrame was introduced to the court of Queen Mary, and this is a skill of using knots and half hitches, square knots, and we'll come to that, to form garments and fabrics that really took off with the 1960s hippie revolution. And in the 1800s, knots became extremely important to the British sailors and the American sailors who were sailing around the globe. And there are plenty of knots. And that's where knots comes from for sailing, is a length of rope with a series of knots with a board on the end, and they literally counted distance traveled and speed using a fixed length of knots along a rope. But knot tying is actually a critical skill for surgeons. It's so critical actually that knot tying is also taught to astronauts going into space. And the primary function of knot tying is to allow the suture to be tightened around a vessel or itself and to remain tight to prevent a leak or hemorrhage. Of course, inside the body, we are using our hands, and that's what we'll focus on today. But in laparoscopic surgery, a lot of the knots are formed outside the body, and they're slid down and pushed down with knot pushers. There are 3 key principles, I think, to knot tying. And if you go on YouTube, there are plenty of videos showing you how to tie knots, and I'll revisit it again this evening, but there'll be a style to fit you. But there are important principles. Firstly, your knot needs to be square, and I'll point that out. Secondly, it needs to be tightened on what you're tying. And thirdly, In doing so, you must not displace the object you are tying or pull the knot off. And that is where the finger on the knot comes. So let's look at these knots and show you how to practice and rehearse them in detail. I'll take you over. Sorry about this, the camera's got caught on the computer, and bring you over to the overhead cam. So we're all familiar with knots, and the simple knot that we're aware of is the reef knot, and you'll see that sits flat on the table. But if we tie it not right over left and left over right, we end up with what's called a cross knot. And this cross knot is also colloquially referred to as a granny knot. And over time, and I'm pulling it with my fingers in the knot and working it like this, you'll see that it's slowly but surely coming undone. Whereas the flat knot, no matter how hard I work or pull it, this remains tight and secures itself. And I suppose this is the reason why your shoelaces come undone. On the right here is a square flat knot, and the bow is horizontal across the shoe, whereas on the left we have a granny knot or cross knot, and see the bow is down the shoe. That's the most common knot that you'll do, and it explains why your shoelaces come undone with working during the day. You see, no matter how much movement I put on this, this is square. So the second important thing is, how do we secure or tighten that flat knot? And that comes by introducing what's called the surgeon's knot, which is 2 throws in the same direction followed by square knots, and this tightens and grips as you pull it down, particularly on drains, as we'll demonstrate. The other way is to throw 2 half hitches, and literally that slides down and locks on itself like that and self-ties and is secure. So those are the fundamental principles, and we'll come to the finger on the knot in a moment. Now many people have knot tying jigs, etc. Well, what I have here is a simple elastic band and 2 pencils and a block of wood, and we're going to do some knot practice. And I'm deliberately doing a fine suture here to demonstrate the principle of knot tying, whether you have got a fine suture or a thick suture is exactly the same. You probably won't be able to see the 7/0 that I'm using on this, but what I'm trying to demonstrate here, as I'm alternating my knot throwing between my index finger and middle finger, my hands are moving forwards and backwards, a bit like a loom. So, what does that mean, and how do you practice? The best way to start is to use a shoelace with 1/3 of it coloured, the short length and a long length, and we're holding it between thumb and index finger and extending the short end out with my index finger and form of a figure of 4. And I'm using my finger to flick that round and bring it through the loop and towards me, and you see that's flat. I've now picked it up between my thumb and index finger. I'm supinating my hand, again crossing the suture, and I've got a figure of 4, and I'm using my middle finger to take the suture through the loop and down. And I'm back again, holding it now between the thumb and middle finger, extending the short end out with my index finger, flicking it through the loop and bringing it towards me. And that is how each time I am able to tie a flat knot. Now I urge you to practice with both hands, and I must admit that I'm not as adept as knot tying with my left hand, and I wish I had been berated, chastised, cajoled, whatever you like to say, as a trainee into doing it with both hands. and I suppose I've got lazy over the years, but ideally one should be able to tie with both hands. My preference is with my right, but the same applies with my left hand. In taking it through the loop and moving the thread away each time, making sure that it is flat. So the next important principle is how to ensure that it is actually tight. And you see I've been practicing, and this coat hanger is going to offer a surface, a rigid surface, to ensure that my knot is tight. And the way to do that is put 2 throws the same direction. 1, 2, take it down and make sure it beds down. And this goes with the finger on the knot. You should be able to bed this down and not lift the coat hanger off the table. So I'd say finger on the knot, or just beyond it, and the direction of pull is equal and opposite to bed it down. I now can continue my flat knots, alternating my hand either side to continue the number of knots. So we'll do that once more. The other way to do it is to throw 2 half hitches, to 2 throws, one followed by the other, 1 down, same direction, down, and now I've got 2 half hitches and pull it down. Now the thing about this, with a braided suture or piece of string, it doesn't slide very easily and therefore is at risk of fraying as well. And to test how tight material is see if it moves on the coat hanger. Now once you've mastered the art of tying knots with a piece of string, then I suggest you move on to other material. And I've got cotton here and a bit of fishing line, and this is actually a bit of proline. You can see the memory on there, alright, whereas a braided suture hasn't got any memory. The memory on this proline means that you need to put more knots on it to secure it. But if you put too many, there's a problem, and I'll come to that in a moment. With a braided suture, you may have less, and I like the number 5 for braided suture and 7 for monofilament, but it depends on the thickness. But the same applies when you're knot tying. Once you're comfortable and you're certain that all your knots are going down flat, try doing it with a bit of cotton. So again, I'm going to put 2 knots, throws the same direction. I'm going to put this down, put my finger in the knot. Now if I pull too hard and I'm too aggressive, my cotton will break. And now I'll cross it over and bring it back on my sutures. And do practice with both your right hand and your left hand as well. As I said, the braided suture is not very good for slipping down, whereas the monofilament does slide down very nicely. That's 1 throw the same direction. I'm going to keep it down, put another throw the same direction, and now I'm holding this down to tighten the knot and make sure that is buried. Of course, when you're tying any vessel, it is important to ensure that you dissect it off clean and you don't have any extraneous tissue in it. Now as I'm doing this, and I'm putting 7 throws on it, you'll notice that as it builds up over time, it forms a spike. Now these proline spikes on any surface on which the patient is resting, walking, or leaning is going to dig into the tissue and dig into the skin. And I've seen these proline knots perforate. And I'd recommend that if you're closing deep layers with a monofilament, please come from inside out, then outside in, to make sure these knots are buried, to avoid the effect of that. And I was just pressing a banana against that earlier, because I like the banana, I'll just turn the light off here so you can see. I'll probably bring it back towards the end, but I pressed this against the stubble and you can see the marks already on this. And if you regard a patient lying in bed as fruit sitting in a fruit bowl, it doesn't take very long for soft tissues to suffer from pressure necrosis. Of course, the most important thing you're going to be tying in with your surgery is a drain. And I've used a bit of hose pipe here, and it's very important that your drains are properly secured. So that double throw or surgeon's knot in the beginning is very, very useful on a solid object like a drain. 2 throws the same direction, take it down and make sure it is buried and my finger is on the knot. There you go. And now I'm going to just pop this in because that's a little bit too light on that, lifting off the table. And now I can continue my knots down. And the important thing is that as you tie it, you don't want a drain knot that is not holding your drain properly like that. So of course, when you're tying knots on the surface, this is relatively straightforward exercise. But now we need to actually think that we are tying knots at depth. And simply using a paper cup and a pencil is a great way to practice tying at depth. And I've put this pencil in at 1 phalanges deep, and I've got this cup on a piece of blue tack on a plate, and the idea is that I should be able to tie the knot securely without pulling the cup off. So it's another way of tying at depth, and that's at 1 phalanx, making sure it's bedding down and putting the rest of the sutures on. Now, as I do 5 for braided suture, 7 for monofilament, you can imagine if you're doing 19 to 25 sutures around an aortic valve, if you continue to throw sutures beyond what is necessary to secure the knot, you're now showing off and using up precious time. So you do what's necessary. So once you've tied the knot on the pencil, you can test it and see if it moves. Of course, you can go to different depths of this and go to 2 phalanges deep, or let's try 3 phalanges deep. And I've got a bit of material mounted here, and the idea is to actually be able to put this down without pulling this off the cup. Now have I got the 2 ends ready? Okay, there you go. So this is now stitching at depth, or tying a knot at depth. And that's 2 phalanges deep. So I'm going to put a throw on it. I haven't actually had it secured down there, but you can see that I'm now testing the limit of my knot tying right at the bottom there. And I have not secured, I should have secured this perhaps earlier so it didn't come off, and throw a second tie, and again, important to get your finger right in and down beyond the knot to ensure it's secure. Again, you can test that secure by seeing if it moves along the pencil, and it doesn't. There you go. So, what about instrument tying itself? Well, first thing, we often use knots to secure our sutures. And the 2 things I want to point out here is I've got 7 throws on this proline suture on this side, and as I pointed out, if you're closing deep layers, this proline suture could actually be palpable through the different layers. The second thing is proline is a common suture used in cardiovascular surgery. And if I were to take this needle through the other side, and if I had too many throws on it, you'll see as I pull it through that that may indeed pull through the wall of the aorta. Certainly, if I come in on the same side and pull the suture through, I will be creating an extra large hole in the aorta itself as I closed it. So do beware that your knot can be dangerous and cause a problem. So many people have been sent suture pads to practice their stitching, which is absolutely fine. But the problem is that I don't think that that will give you good feedback on instrument tying. And the simple thing with instrument tying, on a monofilament in particular, you want to be sure that the knot is secure. So an instrument tie is really having one short end, again, note, 2 throws, 1, 2, over, take the short end, pull it down square, alright, to approximate the ends, and then lock it. Okay, and now you can throw your flat knots on to secure it. Now note, with this banana model, if I pull too hard, you'll see and feel my knot cheese wiring through the banana. And really what we're wanting is to ensure that we're bringing tissue apposition in rather than strangulation. And we need to bear in mind that these sutures themselves can easily cheese wire through tissues like that. So bear in mind, as your instrument tying, etc., do ensure that you use lightness of touch and tissue apposition and not strangulation. Of course, a fun way to test whether your knots are good and secure is to use blown up balloons. And I have one here from a few weeks ago, well, I'd say at the end of the cycle, and it's dropped on the floor, but it is 8 weeks and it is still blown up. But to prove to you, I'll show it to you in a moment when I take the camera off, but again, the best thing to do is partly blow up a balloon, and now we're going to tie off the end. And I'm just going to use simple cotton, and certainly I use surgical gloves on previous demonstrations, but to be honest, that's an expensive, and I'm using a surrogate here with a balloon. So 2 throws, same direction. I'm going to secure the balloon as we do it, and I'm pulling it down, and my fingers on the knot. Alright, and I'm keeping it on the knot to make sure it's bedded, and now I can secure the knot with a series of other flat knots. And if you don't believe me, I'll take this off. There you go. I think that is secure. And the last one I did also happened to be green. It has fallen on the floor down there, and that was from 9 weeks ago. I think we can conclude that is secure. So as I said in the beginning, there are numerous different videos showing you how to tie knots. It what worked for you. I like the concept of my hands moving backwards and forwards as if they're working on a loom, as did those Arab weavers do in 1200 AD. The important thing is to ensure your knot is flat, because I hope I've demonstrated that reef knots do not come undone, whereas cross knots do. And I only had one consultant in my 17 years of training who stood there and observed flat knot, cross knot, flat knot, cross knot, And he did that every time I operated. And I do thank him. And that's Mr. William Walter Frederick Southwood, now deceased. He was the master of the apothecaries when I joined the apothecaries back in 1987. The second thing is to ensure that your finger goes on the knot. One, it maintains the tension, and it's across the knot to ensure that you're not pulling it off or pulling it away, because that is a common mistake that could be catastrophic, particularly in the old days when your hand's down in the pelvis and you're tying off the middle rectal artery. I hope this makes sense. I hope that you are practicing. I look forward to seeing more of your pictures, and thank you Sura, Vlad and Harris and others for sending your pictures and videos. Do encourage people to follow the website. I look forward to hearing from you with pictures and videos and receiving feedback as well. I hope you join me next week for another episode of the Black Belt Academy of Surgical Skills, and we're going to return to assisting. And my son has agreed to join me next week, and believe it or not, he's grown another centimetre over the past month, so most certainly taller than me, and we'll come to the different heights as we talk about assisting. Suture UK have done a fabulous tweet survey on what makes a good assistant, and I believe good assistants make good surgeons, and good surgeons make good assistants. But all of this comes back to sticking to the principles. Thank you very much indeed for joining the Black Belt Academy. Wherever you are in the world, I do hope you're safe, and we're thinking of all our colleagues across the globe in areas where the COVID pandemic is running riot. Thank you, good day, and good night.